The snow fell in thick curtains across the frozen valley, each flake catching what little light remained in the dying afternoon. Through the white veil, 7 figures moved in single file, their dark cloaks stark against the endless pale. They walked with purpose, these travelers, following a path only their leader could see. The cold pressed against exposed skin like iron, but they did not hurry. They had learned that haste in winter meant death. My name is William, and I was the last in that line. I was the stranger they had found half frozen 3 days before, barely alive in a snowdrift. I was the outsider they should have left behind. But they didn't. And that choice would change everything I thought I knew about survival, about people, about what it means to truly live. If this story moves you, please subscribe. There are more journeys like this one, more tales of the forgotten corners of our world where the ancient ways still whisper their wisdom. I had been a scribe in the monastery at Whitby, copying texts and keeping records. A quiet life, predictable and safe. But when the harvest failed 2 years running, and the monastery could no longer feed all its members, the youngest were sent away. I had thought to reach my uncle's village in the north before the snows came. I had thought many things that proved to be foolish. The winter arrived early that year, fierce and unforgiving. It caught me 3 days from any shelter I knew, alone on a road that disappeared beneath the white. I remember the cold more than anything else from those last hours before they found me. Not the hunger, though my belly had been empty for days. Not the fear, though it had been constant. Just the cold, seeping through my threadbare cloak, turning my fingers to wood, my thoughts to fog. I remember thinking it would be easy to simply lie down, to let the snow cover me like a blanket, to sleep. Then I heard voices. At first I thought them spirits, perhaps angels come to carry me away. But the hands that gripped my arms were solid and real, and the words they spoke were no heavenly tongue but the rough dialect of the mountain people. They lifted me, these strangers, and one of them, a young man near my own age, wrapped his own cloak around my shoulders despite the bitter wind. "Can you walk?" the young man asked, his accent thick but his meaning clear. I tried to answer, but my jaw would not move. He simply nodded, as if my silence told him everything he needed to know. "Hold to me then," he said. "We have far to go yet before nightfall." That was 3 days ago. 3 days of stumbling through snow, of huddling in the lee of rocks when the wind howled too fierce to continue, of sips of broth that burned like fire in my throat. 3 days of watching these people move through the killing cold as if they belonged to it, as if they were made of the same substance as ice and stone. And now, on this 4th day, they had found what they were searching for. I did not yet know what that was, but I could feel it in the way the leader, a broad man named Godric, had quickened his pace, in the way the others leaned forward as they walked, as if pulled by invisible threads. "There," Godric said, his voice carrying back along the line. He did not point, but we all saw it. A break in the cliff face ahead, dark against the white. An opening. "Is it the place?" the young man beside me asked. His name was Oswin, I had learned. He had barely left my side since they found me. "We will see," Godric replied. "Alwyn, scout ahead." A lean figure near the front of the line broke away, moving with the fluid grace of a wolf. He reached the opening and disappeared into the darkness. We waited, the snow settling on our shoulders, our breath rising in clouds. The silence was profound. Even the wind seemed to hold itself, watching. Alwyn emerged, and even from a distance I could see his face had changed. He waved us forward, urgent. Something in the cave had surprised him. Something. We reached the entrance, and Godric was the first inside. I hung back, uncertain, until Oswin's hand on my shoulder gently pushed me forward. One by one we entered the darkness, leaving the white world behind. The first thing I felt was the absence of wind. Just that was a blessing beyond measure. The second thing I felt was warmth, not the warmth of a fire. No one had entered before us to light one. This was something else, something rising from the stone itself, from the earth below. I could feel it on my face, on my frozen hands. Real warmth, impossible warmth, in the heart of winter's deepest cold. The old tales were true, a woman's voice said in the darkness. I would learn her name was Mildred, and she was Godric's wife. The grotto exists. Light the torches, Godric commanded. Let us see what we have found. Flint struck, sparks flew, and a torch caught, then another, and in their growing light I saw. The cave opened into a chamber far larger than I had imagined from outside. The walls were smooth stone, dark and gleaming with moisture, and from the floor, in a dozen places, steam rose in gentle columns, wisping and curling in the torchlight. The air was thick with it, warm and wet, carrying a mineral scent that was somehow clean and pure. Hot springs, Alwyn said, his voice full of wonder, all through the chamber. Indeed, as the light grew, I could see pools of water scattered across the floor, their surfaces dancing with reflected flame. Some were small, barely wider than a man's shoulders. Others were vast, dark, their depths unknown. And all of them steamed in the cold air, breathing warmth into the space. This will do, Godric said simply. He turned to face us all. We rest here. 3 days, perhaps 4, until the storm passes. There was a murmur of relief from the group. Only then did I realize how deeply tired they all were, these people who had seemed inexhaustible. They set down their packs with sighs that spoke of burdens carried too long. They moved to the walls and began pulling out blankets and supplies. You, Godric said, and I realized he was speaking to me. What is your name? William, my lord, I managed, my voice rough from disuse. I am no lord, he replied. Just Godric. You know Oswin already. That is my wife Mildred, and they're my daughters Aylwyn and young Sinowise. He pointed to a woman near Mildred, and a girl of perhaps 10 winters. The scout is Alwyn, and this old bear is Wulfric, who claims to remember when dragons still flew. The old man snorted. I claim no such thing. But my grandfather spoke of them, and his grandfather before him. Someone must have seen them, or why would we tell the tales? This is the question that troubles you, old man, Mildred asked, but there was affection in her voice. Not whether we'll survive the winter, but whether dragons once flew. If we survive, Wulfric said, settling himself near one of the smaller pools, we'll do it with stories to keep our spirits warm. And if we don't survive, well, the dragons will have company in death. It was a dark jest, but it made Oswin laugh, and even Godric's stern face softened. I watched them arrange themselves in the chamber, these people who had saved my life, and I felt a strange mix of gratitude and fear. I owed them everything, but I knew nothing of who they were or where they were going, or why they had saved me at all. As if reading my thoughts, Godric spoke again. You wonder why we brought you with us. It was not a question, but I nodded anyway. Because the old laws say to give shelter to those who need it, he said. And because— He paused, looking at me with eyes that seemed to see deeper than skin. Because sometimes the ones we save are meant to save us in turn. I did not understand what he meant. Not then. But I would learn in the days to come that Godric spoke only truth, and that the grotto we had found would become more than shelter from the storm. It would become— But I am getting ahead of the tale. Let me tell it as it happened, moment by moment, revelation by revelation. For there is wisdom in the telling, and wisdom is something this world has forgotten how to value. The first night in the grotto, I mostly slept. My body demanded it, pulling me down into darkness despite my desire to stay awake and learn about these people. I remember Mildred pressing a cup of something hot into my hands. Remember the taste of herbs and honey. Remember her hand on my forehead checking for fever. Then nothing until I woke to find thin daylight filtering through the cave entrance and the sound of voices echoing softly off stone walls. I sat up slowly, every muscle protesting. I was wrapped in blankets I didn't remember being given, lying on furs I hadn't noticed in the darkness. Near me, young Sinowise sat cross-legged, carefully working on something with her small hands. When she saw I was awake, she smiled. "You snore," she informed me seriously, "like a bear in his den." "I apologize," I said, not sure what else to say to a child. "It's all right," she replied. "Father says it means you were truly tired, that your body was doing its work of healing." She held up what she had been working on, a small figure woven from dried grass. "I made you a guardian, to keep watch while you sleep." She pressed it into my hand. It was warm from being held, and surprisingly detailed for such simple materials. I could make out arms, legs, even a suggestion of a face. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than she could know. "Sinowise," Mildred's voice called from somewhere deeper in the cave. "Leave our guest to wake in peace." "He's already awake, Mother," the girl called back. But she stood, gave me one more smile, and skipped away into the shadows. I tucked the little guardian carefully into my shirt and rose, wrapping one of the blankets around my shoulders. My feet were still tender, but the pain was bearable now. I could walk without wanting to weep at each step. That alone felt like a miracle. The cave was different in daylight. The entrance admitted enough light to see without torches, though shadows still clung to the far corners. The hot springs steamed peacefully, and I could see now that the chamber extended back farther than I'd realized. Multiple passages branched off into darkness, though whether they led anywhere or simply ended in stone, I couldn't tell. Most of the group was gathered near one of the larger pools, and as I approached, I saw they were washing clothes in the warm water. Steam rose around them as they worked, and there was something peaceful about the scene. Mildred and her older daughter Aelwyn scrubbed fabric against smooth stones, while Oswin and Alwyn tended to boots and leather goods, checking for damage. "The sleeper wakes," Wulfric called from where he sat near the cave mouth, keeping watch. "Come, boy, sit with an old man and tell me your tale." I hesitated, looking toward the others, but Godric waved me on. "Go. He'll pester you until you do anyway." So I went and sat beside Wulfric, who studied me with eyes that were surprisingly sharp for one so old. His face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of wind and sun, but his back was straight and his hands steady. "You were a monk," he said. "Not a question." "A scribe," I corrected. "In training to be a monk, perhaps, but the world had other plans," he finished. "It often does." I was going to be a warrior once, you know. Dreamed of it as a boy. Sword in hand, fame and glory." He laughed, a dry sound like rustling leaves. "Instead, I became a shepherd, then a father, then a grandfather. And now I'm an old man who tells stories no one wants to hear." "I would hear them," I said, surprising myself. His eyebrows rose. "Would you now? Even knowing they'll be long?" "I have time," I replied, gesturing at the snow still falling outside. "We all do, it seems." He smiled at that, showing gaps where teeth had been. Wise words. "Very well, then. But first, tell me true. What do you know of the old ways? Of how people lived before the stone churches came?" I thought carefully before answering. "Very little," I admitted. "The monastery taught that those were dark times, full of ignorance and superstition." "And what do you think?" he pressed. I looked around the cave at these people who had saved me, who moved through the winter like it was their natural element, who had found this impossible place of warmth in the heart of cold. "I think," I said slowly, "that perhaps the monastery was wrong about many things." Wulfric's smile grew wider. "Perhaps indeed. Let me tell you something, William the scribe. This grotto we sit in, it was known to the old ones. Long before churches, long before kings and kingdoms as we know them now. The people of this land knew where the earth's warmth rose up, where a person could survive when winter tried to kill. They passed down the knowledge, parent to child, generation to generation." "How do you know this?" I asked. "Because my grandmother told me, and her grandmother told her, back and back until the chain of telling reaches into mist and legend." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "And because we found the marks." "Marks?" "On the walls, in the deep places, handprints in red ochre, ancient beyond reckoning. Proof that others came before, that they too sought shelter here, that they too survived." He paused. "Tomorrow perhaps I will show you. If Godric says it's safe to explore deeper," I wanted to press him for more, but at that moment Godric himself called everyone to gather. We assembled near the largest pool, and I noticed that while we had slept and talked, the group had been busy. Supplies were organized. A space near the cave entrance had been designated for the necessary functions of life, and someone had stretched a leather tarp to create a crude privacy screen for the women. "We'll be here at least 3 days," Godric began without preamble. "The storm outside is not yet at its worst. I've seen these northern blizzards before. They come in waves, and we've only felt the first. To venture out now would be death." No one argued. Even Alwyn, who I was beginning to realize was the most restless of the group, simply nodded. "So we make this place home for now," Godric continued. "Wulfric and I will keep watch at the entrance. Alwyn, explore the back passages, but carefully. We don't know what might be back there. Mildred and Aelwyn, you manage our food stores. We must stretch what we have. Oswin—" He paused, looking at the young man. "You help our guest regain his strength. When the storm passes, he'll need to be able to walk." "And me?" Sinuwise piped up. "You," Godric said, his stern face softening again. "Practice your letters. William is a scribe. Perhaps he can teach you something while we wait." The girl's face lit up. "Truly?" I found myself nodding before I'd consciously decided to agree. "If you wish to learn, I will teach." And so our days in the grotto began to take shape. Structure emerged from chaos, routine from emergency. And I, who had been certain I would die alone in the snow, found myself a part of something I didn't fully understand yet. A community, a family, but again, I rush ahead. Let me tell it as it unfolded, breath by breath, moment by moment. That first full day in the grotto passed in a strange mixture of work and rest. My body still needed healing, so Oswin kept me close, teaching me in quiet moments how to better conserve warmth, how to properly dry my clothes in the steaming air, how to move through cold with less wasted energy. "You walk like someone fighting the winter," he said as we circled the main chamber, me rebuilding strength in my legs. "You tense up, make yourself small. This only makes you colder." "What should I do instead?" I asked. "Accept it," he replied simply. "The cold is not your enemy. It's just the way things are. When you fight against what is, you tire yourself. When you accept, you find you have more strength than you knew." It was a strange philosophy to someone raised in the structured logic of the monastery, but I tried. I relaxed my shoulders, breathed deeper, stopped clenching my jaw against the chill that still crept in from the entrance. And oddly, I did feel warmer. Or perhaps I just felt less miserable, which amounted to the same thing. Sinuwise appeared at intervals throughout the day, bringing me small gifts. A smooth stone from the pool, a feather she'd found near the entrance, a cup of warm water flavored with pine needles. Each time she would stay and ask me questions about letters and words and writing. I found myself explaining things I'd learned so long ago I'd forgotten I knew them. How each letter had a sound. How sounds combined into words. How words carried meaning across time and distance. "So someone far away could know my thoughts?" she asked, eyes wide. "If you wrote them down, yes," I confirmed. "Someone 100 miles away. Someone 100 years in the future." She was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then, "I want to learn that. To send my thoughts into the future." Something about the way she said it caught in my chest. This child, living in a world where survival was measured day by day, dreaming of reaching across centuries. It was beautiful. It was heartbreaking. "Then I will teach you," I promised. "Every day we're here, we'll practice." As the daylight faded outside and torches were lit inside, Mildred produced a pot and began preparing a meal. I watched in fascination as she worked, using the hot spring water to cook grain and dried meat into a stew. The steam and smoke rose together, mingling, and the smell that filled the cave was better than any feast I'd had at the monastery. We ate, gathered in a circle, passing the pot from hand to hand, each taking our portion directly. There were no separate bowls, no assigned places, just the group, sharing what they had equally. When the pot reached me, I hesitated, not sure how much to take, but Oswin nudged me. "Same as anyone else," he said quietly. "You're one of us now." I took my portion, and it was perfect, hot and savory, filling the hollow places in my belly. As we ate, Wulfric began to speak, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a practiced storyteller. "There was a time," he began, "when winter lasted 3 years without break. The snows fell and never melted. The sun grew pale and weak. The animals fled south or died. And the people—" He paused, letting the silence stretch. "The people had to choose. Stay in their villages and starve, or venture out into the endless white to seek the places where Earth's warmth still held. Most stayed. They knew their homes, their fields, their walls. They trusted what they knew." "But some left," Sinuwise said, clearly having heard this tale before. "But some left," Wulfric agreed. "They followed the old stories, the half-remembered songs their grandmothers sang. They searched for the hot springs, the steam caves, the places where you could survive even when the world tried to kill you. Most of those who wandered died. But some— His eyes swept around our circle. Some found places like this, and they lived. And when the long winter finally ended, they emerged, and all they had learned about surviving, about working together, about sharing equally in feast and famine, all that knowledge came with them into the new world. "Is that what we're doing?" I asked before I could stop myself. Surviving a long winter? Godric looked at me across the fire. Every winter is a long winter if you're not prepared. Every winter tests whether you deserve to see spring. He paused. But yes, this particular winter feels like it will be one for the songs, if anyone survives to sing them. It was a sobering thought. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the wind had picked up again, howling like wolves at the mouth of our shelter. We were safe here, warm and fed, but eventually we would have to leave. Eventually we would face what waited beyond the cave. "Tell us another story, old man," Alwyn said, breaking the dark mood. "Something with less death in it." Wulfric chuckled. "Less death? You're asking the wrong storyteller. All the old tales have death in them. It's what makes the living precious." "Then tell one where the death is earned," Mildred said, "where it means something." "Ah," Wulfric said, "now that I can do." And he told us of a warrior woman who defended a bridge against an army, not for glory, but to give her people time to flee a burning city. He told us of a father who walked into a blizzard to find medicine for his child, and came back with frostbite so severe he lost both hands, but the child lived. He told us of a grandmother who starved herself all winter to ensure her grandchildren had enough, and when spring came she was too weak to survive. But the children remembered and grew strong, and told her story until it became legend. Each tale was brutal in its honesty about death, but each one also celebrated life, sacrifice, love. And as I listened, I began to understand something about these people. They didn't fear death because they had accepted it as part of the pattern. What they feared was meaningless death, wasted life, the failure to matter. When the stories finally ended and we prepared for sleep, I lay in my furs near the warm stones and thought about the monastery. We had feared death there too, but differently. We feared the state of our souls, the judgment to come. We prepared for death as if life was merely a test to pass or fail. These people prepared for death by living as fully as possible, by mattering to each other, by passing on stories and knowledge, by surviving so that something of them would continue. I wasn't sure which approach was wiser, but I knew which one had actually saved me when I was dying in the snow. I touched the little grass guardian Sinowise had made me, now tucked under the edge of my blanket. Tomorrow, I thought, I would begin to teach her letters, and perhaps she would teach me something too. The second day in the grotto began with a discovery. Alwyn, who had gone deeper into the cave system the evening before, came back with excitement bright in his eyes. "There are chambers," he reported to Godric. "Many of them, connected by passages. Some are small, but others—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "You should see them. The stone formations are like nothing I've encountered. And there are signs, marks on the walls, as Wulfric said, evidence of old habitation." "Show me," Godric said simply. They prepared torches, and Godric asked me if I was strong enough to come along. I was surprised by the invitation, but nodded eagerly. I wanted to see what lay deeper, wanted to understand this place that had become our sanctuary. Oswin came too, and Wulfric, moving slowly but stubbornly, insisting he could manage. Mildred and the girls stayed at the entrance, maintaining watch and tending to the daily work. Aelwyn waved as we departed, her smile knowing as if she could see something in this expedition that I couldn't yet grasp. The passage Alwyn led us through was narrow at first, requiring us to move single file with torches held high. The walls pressed close, damp and smooth, worn by water over centuries. But after perhaps 50 paces, it opened into a chamber that took my breath away. The ceiling soared above us, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of our torchlight. From it hung formations of stone like frozen waterfalls, pale and gleaming. They met similar formations rising from the floor, creating columns of such perfect symmetry they seemed carved by skilled hands. And everywhere, the glimmer of moisture, the dance of firelight on wet stone, the sense of being inside something alive. The earth's bones, Wulfric breathed beside me. This is what lies beneath all we know, stone and water, and time beyond measure. On the far wall, illuminated by Alwyn's torch, were the marks he had spoken of. Handprints, dozens of them, pressed in what looked like red clay or ochre. Large hands, small hands, the hands of children. They covered a section of wall perhaps 10 feet wide and 6 feet high, overlapping in places, each one a declaration. I was here. I lived. I mattered. I reached out without thinking, my own hand hovering an inch from the nearest print. It was smaller than mine, delicate. A woman's hand, perhaps, or a youth's. How old? I asked, my voice hushed. Who can say? Godric replied. Older than Christianity, older than Rome, perhaps older than the memory of anyone now living. They were like us, Oswin said quietly, seeking shelter, finding this place, leaving their mark so others would know. I thought about that, thought about people long dead, their names forgotten, their lives lost to time. But their hands remained, pressed into stone. They had survived at least long enough to make this record, and others had come after them, generation after generation, each one leaving proof of their passage. Should we add ours? Alwyn asked. Continue the tradition. Godric considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yes, but not yet. When we leave, when we know we've survived and can go on, then we'll add our hands. It seems right to mark our departure, not our arrival. We explored further, finding more chambers, more evidence of ancient habitation. Stone rings where fires had been built. Piles of shells and bones where meals had been consumed. And, in one small chamber, something that made even Godric pause in wonder. A carving, worked directly into the stone wall. It showed figures, stick-thin and simple but unmistakably human, surrounding what appeared to be a fire or perhaps a hot spring. Their arms were raised, their bodies in motion. Dancing, I realized, or celebrating. Around them, carved with less skill but clear intent, were animals. Deer, perhaps, or elk. And above everything, a circle with rays emanating from it. The sun. A map, Wulfric said, moving closer. Or perhaps a prayer, asking the sun to return, the herds to come back, warmth to prevail over cold. Did it work? I asked, then felt foolish. These people were long dead. Whether their prayer was answered or not, they had not survived into our age. But Wulfric shook his head. Wrong question, boy. The question is, did they survive long enough to teach their children, to pass on the knowledge of this place, of how to endure? And the answer is yes, because we're here. Because someone remembered, and someone told us, and we followed the old tales to this sanctuary. It was a profound thought, that these ancient people, dead for centuries or millennia, had succeeded not by living forever, but by ensuring others could live. Their victory was in the continuation, not in their own survival. We returned to the main chamber in contemplative silence, each of us processing what we had seen. The others gathered around to hear our report, and Senowise's eyes went wide at the description of the handprints. "Can I see them?" she asked. "Please?" "When you're older," Mildred said firmly. "The passages are too dangerous for little ones." "I'm not little," Senowise protested. "I'm already 10 winters." "Then when you're 11, her mother replied, but with a smile that took any sting from the words. The rest of that day passed in quiet activity. I kept my promise to Senowise, showing her how to form letters by scratching them into soft stone with a harder pebble. She was a quick learner, eager and focused in a way that reminded me of my younger self. Within hours she could form most of the alphabet, though some letters gave her trouble. "Why does G have to be so complicated?" she complained at one point. "Can't we just use a straight line? Then how would you tell it from I countered. She considered this seriously. We could make them different sizes? But then how would you know which was which if they were written far apart? She scowled, realizing the problem, then bent back to her work with renewed determination. I found myself smiling, charmed by her spirit. In another life, she might have been a scholar. In this one, she would be a survivor. And perhaps, with the knowledge I was giving her, she could be both. That evening, as we gathered for our meal, the wind outside reached a new intensity. It screamed past the cave entrance like something alive and furious, and even deep in our shelter we could feel the temperature drop. Godric and Alwyn worked to hang additional hides over the entrance, creating a buffer against the cold, and we all drew closer to the warm pools. "This is the heart of it," Godric said as we ate. "The storm's true fury. It will blow itself out tonight or tomorrow, and then comes the dangerous part." "Dangerous?" I asked. "More dangerous than this?" "The snow," Oswin explained. "When the wind stops, there will be so much snow that finding our path again will be nearly impossible. We could wander in circles, exhaust ourselves, freeze before we realize we're lost." "So how do we navigate?" I asked. Godric pointed at Alwyn. He remembers. Every rock, every tree, every turn. He holds the map in his head. I looked at the lean scout with new respect. To memorize an entire journey through featureless white, to be trusted with all our lives, it was a tremendous responsibility. "Don't look so impressed," Alwyn said, catching my gaze. "It's just paying attention, noticing. Most people look but don't see. I see." "Teach me," I said impulsively, "how to see like you do." He studied me for a moment. "You really want to learn?" "I do." "Then tomorrow," he said, "I'll show you. We'll stand at the entrance and I'll teach you to read the landscape, to notice what matters and let go of what doesn't. It won't make you a pathfinder, not in a few lessons, but it might keep you alive someday." That night, as the wind howled and the temperature dropped further despite the grotto's warmth, Wulfric told us more stories. He spoke of the old gods, the ones who ruled before the Christ came. Not with reverence exactly, but with respect for what they represented. Thor was the thunder, they said. Odin was the wind and the ravens. Freya was the spring's return. the promise of life after death. He poked at the small fire we'd built for light more than warmth. We don't worship them now, of course. The priests say they were demons, or false, or never real at all. But I think they were something else. What? I asked, genuinely curious. Stories we told ourselves about forces we couldn't control. Ways to make sense of a world that kills you if you don't understand it. Thor throwing lightning. That's just how people explained storms before they knew about clouds and air and all the rest. But the lesson behind the story? Respect the storm. Fear it. Prepare for it. That wisdom is real, even if Thor never was. So the stories matter, even if the gods don't, Oswin asked. Especially if the gods don't, Wulfric replied. Because then the stories are all we have. The accumulated knowledge of everyone who survived before us, wrapped in memorable tales so we don't forget. I thought about the monks at Whitby, copying scripture, preserving the word. Were they so different from Wulfric with his pagan tales? Both were trying to pass something essential forward. Both believed that some knowledge was too important to let die. The church says your stories are lies, I said carefully. Dangerous lies. The church, Wulfric said without rancor, is young. Give it 1,000 years and see if its stories sound any more true than mine. Or less. Truth isn't about whether it happened exactly as told. Truth is whether it teaches you to survive. It was a radical idea to me then, that truth could be divorced from fact, that the value of a story lay not in its historical accuracy, but in its practical wisdom. But surrounded by people who had saved my life by following ancient tales to an ancient place, I couldn't entirely dismiss it. We slept that night to the sound of the storm's rage, and I dreamed of handprints on walls, of people long dead still reaching forward through time, still trying to teach us how to live. The third day dawned. Though in the cave it was hard to tell dawn from any other time, except by the gradually increasing light at the entrance. When I woke, the wind had finally died. The silence was almost shocking after 2 days of constant howling. Godric was already at the entrance, looking out at what the storm had left behind. When I joined him, I understood Oswin's warning from the night before. The world beyond was transformed. Where there had been rocks and trees and some sense of landscape, now there was only white. Smooth, unbroken white in every direction, sculpted by the wind into curves and ridges that looked like frozen waves. "We stay one more day," Godric said without looking at me. "Let the snow settle. Let us gather strength. Tomorrow we leave." "Can we make it?" I asked. "Through all that?" "We'll see," he replied. Then he turned to me, his expression serious. "William, you're stronger now than when we found you, but you're not strong enough. Not for what's coming. Today you work with Oswin and Alwyn. You learn, you practice. Tonight we rest. Tomorrow," he shrugged. "Tomorrow we trust the old knowledge and our own feet." I spent that day learning. Alwyn taught me to read shadows and light, to understand how the sun's position changed through the day, and how that could guide you even when clouds blocked direct sight of it. He showed me how to judge distance by counting paces, how to mark your trail with small signs that others might miss but you would recognize. He taught me that survival was often about the small details, checking your boots for ice buildup, keeping your hands moving even when they weren't doing anything, never letting yourself get too warm because sweat was death in winter. Oswin taught me different things. How to distribute weight when walking through deep snow. How to breathe in cold air without hurting your lungs. how to fall without injury when the ice betrayed you. Practical things, physical things, survival written in the body rather than the mind. And Sinowise, in the afternoon, showed me her letters. She'd been practicing, and her hand was already steadier. She wrote her name in the soft stone, carefully forming each letter. Sinowise. Then she looked up at me with pride. "Now I'll never be forgotten," she said. "Even if I die, my name will be here." I wanted to tell her she wouldn't die, that she had years and years ahead of her. But I'd learned enough in these few days to know that was a promise I couldn't make. So instead, I said, "Your name will be here, and I'll remember it. And if I survive to write again, I'll put it in my records. Sinowise, daughter of Godric and Mildred, who learned her letters in a cave during the storm of the 7th winter." She beamed at that, apparently satisfied with the scope of her immortality. That evening, our last night in the grotto, felt different. There was an anticipation in the air, a tension that came from knowing we would soon be testing ourselves against the world again. Mildred checked and rechecked our supplies. Godric and Alwyn discussed routes and landmarks. Wulfric sat near the entrance, humming an old tune under his breath. I helped Aelwyn prepare the evening meal, which she welcomed with a smile. She was a quiet woman, I'd noticed. She spoke rarely, but when she did, people listened. She had her mother's practical competence and her father's steady strength. "Are you afraid?" she asked me as we worked, her voice soft enough that only I could hear. I considered lying, then decided against it. "Yes. I barely survived before, and I was fresh then. Now I'm weak from injury. I don't know if I can do it. You won't be alone this time," she said simply. "That's the difference. Before, you had only yourself. Now you have us. And we don't leave people behind." "Why not?" I asked. "Why take the risk? I'm nothing to you, a stranger, dead weight." She looked at me with eyes that were older than her years. "My sister will carry the knowledge you gave her for the rest of her life. That's not nothing. And my father saw something in you that made him decide you were worth saving. He's never wrong about such things." She paused. "And maybe, when we reach our destination, you'll teach more people to read and write. Knowledge like that, it spreads, it grows, it changes things. That's worth the risk of one man who can barely walk." It was said without cruelty, just stating fact. And it made me more determined than ever to prove I could carry my own weight, at least enough not to be a burden. That night, Wulfric told his longest story. It was about the first people, the ones who came to this land when the ice was retreating, when the world was young and everything was dangerous and new. He spoke of their journey north, following the herds, learning the land, discovering the places where warmth persisted through winter. He spoke of their mistakes and their victories, their losses and their adaptations. And he spoke of something he called the chain of hands. Each generation, he said, reaches back to grasp the hands of those who came before, and reaches forward to give hands to those who come after. We are links in a chain, you see. Not the beginning, not the end, but the continuation. And the chain is only as strong as the weakest link's willingness to hold on. He looked around at all of us. Tomorrow we go back into the cold. Some of us might not make it. That's the truth of winter. But those who do will carry what we learned here, about working together, about finding shelter, about surviving, and they'll pass it on. The chain continues. "Will you add your hand to the wall before we leave?" Sinowise asked. "Like you said we should?" Godric nodded slowly. At dawn, we'll all go to the Chamber of Hands. We'll leave our mark, and then we'll leave this place to whoever comes next. There was something ceremonial about the way he said it, something that made even this simple act feel important. We were part of something larger than ourselves. Our survival mattered not just for us, but for everyone who came after. I slept poorly that night, anxious about the morning. But when I did sleep, I dreamed of hands, reaching backward, reaching forward, holding on. Dawn came gray and cold, but the storm was truly past. We gathered in the main chamber, and Godric led us, single file once more, back through the passages to the Chamber of Hands. The ancient prince seemed to glow in our torchlight, all those lives pressed into stone. Godric went first. He mixed red clay with water from the spring until it was the right consistency, then pressed his large hand firmly against a bare section of wall. When he pulled away, the print remained. Clear, undeniable, proof. One by one, the others followed. Mildred beside her husband. Aylwin and Sinowise side by side, the small hand and the medium one. Oswin, Alwyn, Wulfric, each adding their mark to the centuries of marks already there. Then it was my turn. I hesitated with the clay on my palm, suddenly overwhelmed by what this meant. I was nobody, a failed scribe, barely alive. Did I deserve to add my hand to this wall, to claim a place among people who truly belonged to this land? Go on, Wulfric said softly behind me. You survived. You learned. You mattered. That's all it takes to earn your place. I pressed my hand to the stone, felt the cool surface against my palm, held it there for a long moment, and then pulled away. My print joined the others. William, it seemed to say. I was here. I lived. I continued the chain. We stood in silence for a moment, all of us looking at what we had created. 8 new hands added to thousands of old ones. The link continued. The chain held. Then Godric turned. Now we go. We trust our legs, our knowledge, and each other. And we see what comes next. The journey out of the grotto and into the transformed landscape was like being born into a new world. The first steps were hardest, leaving the warmth behind, feeling the cold slam into us like a physical thing. But we were prepared now, bundled in every layer we had, moving together in a tight group that shared heat and blocked wind. Alwyn led, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the landscape in ways I was only beginning to understand. Godric brought up the rear, making sure no one fell behind. I was in the middle, supported by the presence of people on all sides. The snow was deep, sometimes reaching my thighs, but it had crusted over in places where the wind had packed it hard. This made walking treacherous. Sometimes you could walk on top. Sometimes you broke through suddenly, throwing off your balance. But Alwyn seemed to know where the crust would hold, steering us along a path that minimized the breaking through. We walked in silence mostly, saving our breath for the work of moving. The world was silent too, muffled by snow. No birds called, no trees rustled, just the crunch of our passage and the sound of our breathing. After perhaps 2 hours, Alwyn called a halt. We gathered close while he and Godric consulted in low voices, pointing at features in the landscape I couldn't recognize. Then Alwyn nodded, and we moved on, bearing slightly more to the left than we had been. What was that about? I asked Oswin quietly as we walked. Checking landmarks, he replied. Making sure we're on course. It's easy to drift when everything looks the same. One small error at the beginning becomes huge by the end. We stopped again at midday, huddling together to share food from our packs. Dried meat, hard bread, water from skins we kept close to our bodies so it wouldn't freeze. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, casting a strange, flat light across the snow. Everything seemed to glow, but there were no shadows to give depth or definition to the landscape. "How much farther?" I asked Godric as we ate. "2 more days if the weather holds," he replied. 3 if it doesn't. We'll camp tonight in the lee of rocks, I know. Tomorrow we cross the open plain. The day after we should reach the valley. And then?" He smiled slightly. "And then you meet the rest of the community. My brothers and their families. All the others who came north when the harvest failed. You'll see what we're building, William. A place where the old ways and new knowledge can both survive. Where people matter more than position. Where—" He trailed off, and I saw something in his expression that I hadn't seen before. Uncertainty. Worry. "What is it?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, then, "We've been gone longer than planned. The storm delayed us. I hope—" He didn't finish, but I understood. He hoped they were all right. Hoped they'd survived without him. Hoped we weren't walking toward tragedy. We pushed on through the afternoon, and as the light began to fail, we came upon the rock formation Godric had mentioned. It was massive, a tumble of boulders that must have fallen from some cliff face in ancient times, now half buried in snow but still providing shelter from the wind. Alwyn found a gap between 2 large stones that created a space just big enough for all of us if we pressed close. We crawled in, grateful to be out of the wind, and worked quickly to make camp. No fire was possible here, no fuel, and too much risk of smoke choking us in the confined space. But we had each other's warmth and the insulation of the stones around us. We ate another cold meal and then settled for the night. There was no room to move, barely room to breathe without touching someone else. But in that press of bodies I felt something unexpected. Safety, community, connection. "Tell us a story," Sinuise said to Wulfric from where she was wedged between her mother and father. "Too tired," the old man replied, but his voice was fond, not harsh. "Then I'll tell one," the girl said. "Once there was a man who was lost in the snow." And she told us a story, simple, childish, but charming in its way, about a lost man who was found by kind strangers and learned to see the world differently. It was, I realized, my story. She'd made a tale of what had happened to me. When she finished, Mildred kissed the top of her head. "That was lovely, little one. You have your great-grandfather's gift for telling." "Will you teach me all the stories, Wulfric?" Sinuise asked, "so I can remember them forever?" "I'll teach you what I know," he replied. "And you'll add your own. That's how it works. Each teller adds a little, changes a little. The stories grow and change, but the truth at their heart remains." "What truth?" I asked, curious. "That we survive by helping each other," he said simply. "That alone we are weak, but together we are strong. That the cold doesn't care about us, but we care about each other, and that makes all the difference." It was perhaps the simplest wisdom I'd ever heard. But pressed together in that gap between stones, at the mercy of winter, I understood it in my bones. We would survive this not because any one of us was strong enough, but because all of us together were strong enough. I slept fitfully that night, waking often to adjust position or flex fingers and toes to keep the blood flowing. But each time I woke, I could hear the breathing of the others around me, and it comforted me. I was not alone. Whatever came, I would face it surrounded by people who had chosen to include me in their survival. Morning came slowly, light filtering into our stone shelter gradually. We emerged stiff and cold but alive, ready to face the day's march. Godric had said this would be the hardest part, crossing open ground with no shelter. We would have to make it to the far side before nightfall or risk dying of exposure. "Stay close," Alwyn warned as we set out. "The wind crosses the plain like a knife. If you fall behind, if you get separated—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The plain was vast, and within an hour of leaving our shelter, I understood what he'd been trying to tell me. The wind was constant, relentless, stealing warmth, making every step forward a battle. My legs ached, my lungs burned. The cold found every gap in my clothing and pressed inside. But around me, the others marched on. Oswin stayed at my side, occasionally gripping my arm when I stumbled. Aelwyn moved ahead with her characteristic quiet strength. Sinew-Eyes walked between her parents, small but determined. And somewhere in me, watching them, I found reserves I didn't know I had. We are the chain, I thought. We hold on. Around midday, when the sun was at its height and still gave almost no warmth, disaster struck. A section of snow that had looked solid collapsed under Alwyn's weight, and he fell with a surprised shout into what must have been a hidden crevasse or hollow beneath. We all froze. Godric moved forward carefully, testing each step, until he could look down into the hole Alwyn had made. "I'm all right," Alwyn's voice called up, sounding more annoyed than hurt. "Twisted my ankle, but nothing broken. I need help getting out." Godric looked back at us. "Rope. Carefully now." Wulfric had the rope in his pack. We passed it forward, and Godric secured one end to a formation of ice that looked solid. He lowered the other end into the hole. "Can you climb?" he called down. "I think so," Alwyn replied. We watched, holding our collective breath as the rope went taut. Slowly, painfully, Alwyn emerged. His face was tight with pain, and when he tried to put weight on his right foot, he gasped. "How bad?" Mildred asked, all business. "Bad enough," Alwyn admitted. "I can walk, but not quickly, and not for long." Godric and Oswin looked at each other. A whole conversation seemed to pass between them without words. Then Godric nodded. "Oswin leads now," he said. "I'll support Alwyn. The rest of you stay between us. We go slower, but we go together." No one argued. No one suggested leaving Alwyn behind, though with his injury he would slow us all down, potentially risking everyone. We simply reorganized and moved on, Oswin now at the front, reading the landscape with less confidence than Alwyn, but with careful attention. The pace was slower, as Godric had warned. Much slower. The sun, which had been high, began its slide toward the horizon, and we were still on the plain, still exposed, still far from safety. "We're not going to make it to the valley before dark," Oswin said quietly to Godric during one of our brief rests. "I know," Godric replied, "but there's a way station, a hunter's shelter. If we can reach that, we'll survive the night." "How far?" "Another 2 hours at this pace, perhaps less if we're lucky." 2 hours. The sun would set before then. We'd be finishing in darkness. But what choice did we have? We pushed on. The wind picked up as the afternoon wore into evening, and the temperature dropped with the fading light. I could no longer feel my fingers or toes. My face was numb. I walked mechanically, following the person in front of me, trying not to think about how cold I was, how tired, how much I wanted to simply lie down and rest. "Don't stop." Oswin's voice cut through my fog. "Keep moving. We're close now. Close." The word barely registered. Everything was white and gray and fading. The world had become abstract, unreal. Only the movement mattered. One foot, then the other, then the first again, over and over, forever. "There," Godric's voice, sharp with relief. "I see it." I looked up, squinting through eyes that were crusted with ice from my own frozen breath. In the distance, barely visible in the dimming light, I could make out a dark shape against the white. A structure. The way station. We covered the last distance in a stumbling rush, desperation lending us strength we shouldn't have had. The way station was small, barely more than a shed, but it had walls and a roof and a door that opened when Oswin pushed it. We piled inside, collapsing on the floor, gasping, shaking with cold and relief. "Fire," Mildred said. "We need fire now." There was wood stacked against one wall, old but dry. Flint and steel were struck. Sparks flew, and after agonizing seconds, flame caught. We gathered around it like it was the most precious thing in the world, which, in that moment, it was. Slowly, painfully, warmth returned. Fingers and toes burned as blood flow resumed. But we were alive. All of us. Against the odds, we had made it. "Alwyn's ankle needs attention," Godric said once we'd all stopped shaking. Mildred moved to examine it, pressing carefully around the joint while Alwyn gritted his teeth. "Badly sprained," she announced. "Maybe a small fracture. He can't walk on it properly. Not for days at least." The implications hung in the air. We were one day from the valley, one day from safety and the community waiting there. But our best pathfinder was injured and possibly unable to walk. "I'll manage," Alwyn said. "Give me a staff, let me lean on someone, I'll make it." "You'll slow us down," Godric said. It wasn't a criticism, just fact. "Then you go ahead," Alwyn replied. "I'll follow when I can." "No," Godric said flatly. "We don't split up. We don't leave anyone behind." "Even if it risks everyone?" Alwyn asked. "Especially then," Godric replied. "That's when it matters most." I watched this exchange, understanding that this was a test. Not of Alwyn's injury or our ability to carry him, but of whether we meant what we said, about no one being left behind, about the chain holding. "I'll help carry him," I said. The words came out before I'd thought them through. "I'm stronger now than when you found me. I can do this." Oswin looked at me, surprised. Then he nodded. "I'll help too. We'll trade off, 2 at a time supporting him." "I as well," Wulfric added. "These old legs have a few more miles in them." One by one, the others volunteered. Even Sinuwise, though her mother gently told her she was too small. But the offer had been made. The commitment was clear. Godric looked around at all of us, and something in his expression softened. "Then we go together. Tomorrow. Slowly, if we must. But together." We spent that night in the way station, crowded but safe, warm but watchful. Mildred did what she could for Alwyn's ankle, wrapping it tightly, elevating it. Wulfric told stories to keep our spirits up, and I found myself, for the first time since being rescued, feeling like I truly belonged to this group. I had contributed. I had offered my strength when it mattered. I was no longer just someone being saved. I was part of the saving. Morning came, and with it the final push. Alwyn's ankle was slightly better after a night's rest, but he still couldn't put full weight on it. Godric and I fashioned a rough crutch from a piece of the firewood, and we set out with Oswin leading, me and Godric supporting Alwyn between us. The pace was slow, agonizingly slow. But the valley was close now. Godric assured us of this, and the weather was holding, the wind less fierce than the day before. We had a chance. Around midday, as we crested a small rise, Oswin stopped suddenly. He raised his hand, and we all froze. For a terrifying moment, I thought he'd seen danger. Wolves, perhaps, or some other threat. But then he laughed. Actually laughed, the sound startling in the silent landscape. "Look," he said, pointing ahead. "We're home." I looked where he pointed, and there, in the valley below, I could see smoke rising. Not from one fire, but from many. And around those fires, structures. A community. Civilization. Safety. We'd made it. The descent into the valley took another hour, but it was an easy hour despite Alwyn's injury. We could see our destination now, could see people moving about in the distance. And as we got closer, figures began emerging from the settlement, running toward us through the snow. They reached us in a rush of voices and embraces. Godric's brothers, I learned, and their wives and children. Others, too, members of the community who had been worried, who had feared the worst when Godric's party hadn't returned on time. Questions flew. Where had we been? What had delayed us? Were we well? Was everyone all right? And through it all, I stood slightly apart, watching. An outsider still, though perhaps less of one than I had been. Then one of Godric's brothers noticed me. "Who's this, then?" Godric turned, and his hand fell on my shoulder. "This is William. We found him dying in the snow. He's with us now." The brother studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Welcome, William. Any friend of my brother's is family here." Just like that, I was accepted. No questions about where I'd come from or who I'd been. Just acceptance based on Godric's word. We were led into the settlement, and I saw what they had built. It wasn't much. Rough structures mostly, built from logs and stone and whatever materials they could scavenge. But it was organized, efficient. And there were perhaps 50 people here, all working together, all surviving. Godric led me to one of the larger structures. "This is the common hall," he explained, "where we eat together, make decisions together. You'll stay here until we can build you your own space. If you decide to stay, that is." "If I decide?" I repeated. He smiled. "This isn't a prison, William. If you want to continue on to your uncle's village, we'll point you the way come spring. But if you want to stay, to be part of what we're building here, there's a place for you." I looked around, at the rough hall, at the people streaming in now to hear Godric's story of the journey, at Sinuwise still clutching my hand like I might disappear. And I thought about my uncle's village, about returning to scribing and copying and the safe, predictable life I'd known. "I'll stay," I said, "at least for the winter. I can teach reading and writing. I can help record what you're building here. You can be part of the community," Godric said simply. "That's all we ask. Everything else will follow." That night, the whole settlement gathered in the common hall. Godric told the story of our journey, the early winter, finding the grotto, the ancient handprints, the storm, Alwyn's injury, the push to reach home. Others told their own stories from the time Godric had been away. Births and deaths, small victories and setbacks, and through it all I watched and listened and slowly understood what they were building here. Not just a village, not just a place to survive winter, but a new way of living. One where the old knowledge was valued alongside new ideas, where the chain of hands reached both backward and forward, where no one was left behind, not if the community could prevent it. When the stories were finished and people began to drift off to sleep, Wulfric approached me. "You made the right choice," he said. "Staying." "How do you know?" I asked. "Because you're a link in the chain now. Because somewhere in you is knowledge, of reading, of writing, of the world beyond these mountains that needs to be passed on. And you can't pass it on if you leave." He was right, of course, but it was more than that. I stayed because I'd found something I hadn't known I was missing. Not just community, but purpose. Not just survival, but meaning. The winter that year was long and hard. The snows were deep, the cold bitter. We lost 2 of the elders and 1 newborn despite everyone's best efforts. But we also survived. All the rest of us made it through to spring, and in that time I taught. Not just Sinwise, though she was my most eager student, but anyone who wanted to learn. I showed them letters and words, and how to record things so knowledge wouldn't be lost. And they taught me in return. How to hunt, how to track, how to read weather and survive cold. How to be part of something larger than myself. Alwyn's ankle healed slowly but completely. By the time the snows began to melt, he was walking almost normally again, ready to resume his role as pathfinder and scout. When spring finally came, breaking winter's grip with sudden warmth and rushing water, Godric asked me again if I wanted to leave, to continue to my uncle's village. I thought about it, truly considered it. Then I told him no. This was where I belonged now. With these people, in this place, part of the chain. Years passed. Not just one winter, but many. The community grew. More people came, refugees from failed harvests and hard times in the South. We built more structures, developed better ways of storing food, of organizing labor, of making decisions together. We had arguments, of course, and disagreements, but we worked through them because we understood that our survival depended on working together. I became the settlement's record keeper, writing down what we learned, what we tried, what worked and what failed. I taught a new generation to read and write, and they in turn would teach the next. The chain continued. Sinwise grew into a remarkable young woman, strong, intelligent, literate. She became a teacher herself, taking what I'd given her and building on it, adding her own insights and methods. Wulfric died in the 5th winter, peacefully in his sleep after telling one last story about the old gods and the chain of hands. We mourned him, but we also celebrated him, knowing that his wisdom lived on in all of us who had listened to his tales. Godric and Mildred became the acknowledged leaders of the community, not through force or inheritance, but through respect earned over years of sound decisions and genuine care for all. When they spoke, people listened. When they acted, people followed. And the grotto? We returned to it sometimes, in the depths of winter when storms made travel dangerous. We always found it warm and welcoming, and we always added new hands to the walls before we left. The chain growing, link by link, generation by generation. 10 years after that first winter, as I sat in the common hall teaching a group of children their letters, I realized something profound. I wasn't William the failed scribe anymore. I wasn't William the outsider who had nearly died in the snow. I was simply William, teacher, record keeper, member of the community, link in the chain. And I was exactly where I needed to be. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, thank you. These stories matter because they remind us what humans are capable of when we work together, when we refuse to leave anyone behind, when we value connection over isolation. Please consider subscribing to hear more tales like this one. The chain continues, and you're part of it now too. Epilogue. The winter sun hung low and pale over the valley as I watched another generation prepare for their first journey to the grotto. It had become a tradition now, a rite of passage. Every youth, when they reached their 15th winter, made the pilgrimage with an experienced guide to see the ancient handprints, to add their own, to understand viscerally that they were part of something larger than themselves. I was an old man now, white-haired and slow, but still sharp in mind and steady in hand. My records filled an entire room, decades of knowledge about weather, about survival, about what worked and what didn't in this harsh northern land. But the most important thing I'd recorded wasn't practical knowledge at all. It was names. Every person who had come through our community. Every birth. Every death. Every act of courage or kindness or teaching. I wrote them all down, ensuring that no one would be forgotten, that everyone's contribution to the chain would be remembered. Sinuise's daughter, my grandchild in all but blood, approached me now, a young woman ready for her journey. "Grandfather William," she said, using the honorific the community had given me, though I shared no blood with them. "Tell me again about the first winter, about finding the grotto." I smiled, settling into the story I'd told countless times but never tired of telling. About being lost, about being found, about learning that survival wasn't about being strong enough alone, but about being wise enough to accept help. "The lesson," I finished as I always did, "is simple. Alone, we die. Together, we live. Everything else is detail." She nodded, having heard this before but needing to hear it again, needing it to sink deep enough to guide her when things got hard. Then she hugged me, fierce and quick, and ran to join her group. I watched them depart, these young ones who had never known the monastery or the old world I'd left behind. To them, this community was all they'd ever known. Reading and writing were as natural as breathing. Working together wasn't revolutionary. It was simply how things were done. And maybe, I thought, that was the real victory. Not surviving the hard winters, though that mattered. Not building a community that grew and thrived, though that mattered too. But creating a world where the next generation didn't even think there was any other way to live. The chain held because we all grasped it, because we chose every day to value each other over isolation, to pass on what we knew, to add our handprints to the wall and trust that others would come after and add theirs. Godric found me as the sun set, my old friend moving slower now but still strong, still wise. We sat together in comfortable silence, watching the community prepare for evening. Fires were lit, meals were prepared. Children ran between structures, their laughter carrying on the cold air. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying instead of continuing to your uncle's village?" I thought about it, truly considered it as I had many times over the years. Then I shook my head. Never. This is where I belong. With you, with all of you. This is my family now. He nodded, satisfied. "You know," he said, "when we found you that day in the snow, I wasn't sure if saving you was wise. You were so weak, so unprepared. I thought you might not make it." "What changed your mind?" I asked. Oswin, he replied. He said you had good eyes, that you looked at him like he was a person, not a savage. He said anyone who could see humanity in a stranger deserved a chance to live. He paused. He was right. We sat in silence a while longer as the stars began to emerge. Then Godric stood, offered me his hand, and helped me rise. Come, he said. Mildred's made stew, and Wulfric's great-grandson wants to tell the story of the first winter. He says you need to correct him if he gets anything wrong. I laughed. The chain continued. The stories were being passed on. The knowledge persisted. Together we walked toward the common hall, toward warmth and food and community, toward everything that mattered. And behind us, silent and faithful, the winter night settled over the valley. The cold was deep and would last for months yet. But we were ready. We had always been ready. Because we had each other. Because we held the chain. Because we understood, bone deep and permanent, that this was what it meant to be human. To survive together. To remember together. To continue together. The chain held. And it would hold tomorrow. And the day after that. And for all the winters yet to come.